Think Like Socrates, The Secret to Asking Powerful Questions. Written by Ronnie Rowland. Published by Growth Literacy Lounge. A single question has the power to stop a war or start one. It can open a heart or shut it. In the right hands, a question is not an inquiry. It's a revolution. We live in an age drowning in answers, and information is instant. Opinions flood every feed. The pressure to sound certain has never been louder. But beneath that noise, something essential is being lost. The sacred pause, the slow unraveling, the wonder that begins not with a claim, but with a question. Socrates lived in a time of political upheaval, social change, and spiritual confusion. Sound familiar? Yet he did not shout over others or demand allegiance. He simply asked. And he kept asking. His questions weren't ornamental. They were arrows, silent, sharp, and piercing. They exposed illusion, revealed depth, and guided others back to themselves. To think like Socrates is not to mimic his questions, but to embody his courage. It is to enter conversation as an act of service, not performance. To ask not to impress, but to invite. Questions are not just tools, they're mirrors, lanterns, scalpels. And in the hands of someone who listens deeply, they become instruments of transformation. The poet David Whyte once said, "The art of the good question lies in its ability to open up a space into which a person can walk." That's what Socrates did. He made space, not for noise, but for discovery, not for control, but for truth. This book is not about philosophy in the academic sense. It's about how to live, lead, parent, connect, and grow more honestly, by asking differently. Whether you manage a team or raise a child, negotiate conflict or nurture a marriage, the secret to influence is not better speaking. It's better to ask. We will walk with Socrates, not as a relic of the past, but as a mentor for today. Each chapter is a doorway into a different dimension of his method: humility, depth, empathy, listening, silence, leadership, legacy. By the end, you'll be equipped not with scripts, but with a mindset, one that opens others, and yourself, to what's truly possible. Because in a world obsessed with being right, the quiet power belongs to those brave enough to ask. Chapter 1. The Sound of an Empty Cup. A Zen master once welcomed a visiting professor who sought wisdom. As the guest spoke at length about all he knew, the master began to pour tea. The cup filled, then overflowed onto the table. The professor shouted, "It's full, no more will go in." The master replied calmly, "Exactly. Like this cup, you are full of your own opinions. How can I teach you unless you first empty your cup?" Socrates would have nodded in agreement. In the public squares of Athens, he approached senators, shoemakers, poets, and generals, not to lecture, but to ask. When labeled the wisest man in Greece, he protested. "I know one thing," he said. That I know nothing, it wasn't false modesty. It was the secret doorway into every question he asked. He knew that truth could not enter a heart already crammed with certainty. Today we live in a world swollen with answers. Social media rewards certainty, not curiosity. Leaders are expected to speak confidently, not tentatively. Parents, managers, influencers, even friends, everyone rushes to fix, to explain, to correct. We interrupt more than we inquire. We diagnose before we explore. We show up full, not open. But Socrates teaches us something subversive, the power of entering a conversation without armor. His greatness wasn't his knowledge, it was his emptiness. He created a space so unthreatening, so curious, that others lowered their defenses. In doing so, he helped them uncover their own inconsistencies, and more importantly, their own truth. This posture of humility is more than politeness. It's a philosophical discipline. When we admit we don't know, we begin to see more. Questions asked from this place don't aim to dominate or impress. They probe with quiet strength. They say, "I'm not here to win, I'm here to understand." That is the spirit of Socratic inquiry. Thinking like Socrates requires us to make peace with the discomfort of not knowing. It's a discipline of restraint. When someone vents to us, we don't leap to advice. When we encounter a controversial opinion, we resist the urge to pounce. Instead, we begin with the assumption that there is more beneath the surface. We ask, what makes this meaningful to them, or what fear or hope might be shaping this view? Humility also changes how we see disagreement. We stop viewing others as problems to solve and start treating them as mysteries to explore. It turns conversation into collaboration, not combat. Socratic questioning is not a game of verbal chess, it's an excavation site. Each question digs beneath the layers of ego, pain, culture, and history. And like any true excavation, it begins with silence, reverence, and empty hands. Ironically, the more we embrace not knowing, the more others begin to open up. In the presence of someone genuinely curious, people feel safe enough to think out loud, and often, in speaking, they hear themselves for the first time. Socrates knew this. He wasn't trying to insert his ideas into others, he was drawing truth out of them. The philosopher didn't plant flags, he planted questions. So before we learn to ask like Socrates, we must first learn to think like him. And before we think like him, we must first feel what he felt, wonder. Humble, spacious, patient wonder. Like a cup waiting to be filled, not with cleverness, but with clarity. This book begins where all true wisdom begins, with an empty cup. Socratic questioning starts with intellectual humility. Admitting I don't know is not weakness, it's wisdom's invitation. To ask powerful questions, begin by making space for others to speak. Where in your life are you showing up full instead of curious? Today, in one conversation, resist giving advice. Ask one question instead, and let the silence breathe. Chapter 2. Questions that echo. A child tugs at her mother's sleeve. Why is the sky blue? The mother offers a quick answer, because of how light scatters. The child nods, pauses, then asks again, but why does it scatter like that? And so it goes, one question unraveling into another, until the parent sighs, half amused, half exasperated. Yet buried in that relentless curiosity is a secret Socrates would recognize. Some questions echo far beyond their surface. We often stop asking too soon. We fire off a question for the sake of politeness, not pursuit. How was your day? Fine. What do you want to do? Whatever. We accept the first answer as final. But Socrates understood that the first answer is rarely the real one. He believed that true understanding unfolds through layers. One question leads to another, and each response reveals another layer of meaning, belief, or contradiction. Modern life doesn't favor depth. We prize quick conclusions and clever retorts. Leaders are praised for decisiveness, not for the quality of their inquiry. In meetings, the one who speaks first often wins. In politics, soundbites replace thoughtfulness, but powerful questions, Socratic questions, defy that trend. They slow things down. They make us pause, reflect, and examine. They echo in our minds long after the conversation ends. So what makes a question powerful? First, it must be open-ended. Socratic questions rarely ask for yes or no. Instead, they invite expansion. What do you mean by that? What led you to that conclusion? Can you give an example? Second, a powerful question avoids judgment. It does not corner or shame. It gently exposes what's hidden, like a hand brushing dust off a mirror. Third, it creates space for thought, for honesty, for uncertainty. When Socrates asked his fellow Athenians, "What is justice?" or "What is virtue?" he wasn't looking for academic definitions. He was testing the strength of their beliefs. He would ask, "If that is justice, then what about this case?" The questions weren't tricks. They were tools, delicate, persistent, precise. He treated beliefs like stone, tapping gently to see where they cracked, not to destroy, but to understand their true shape. The modern equivalent might sound like this. Someone says, "I just want to be successful." A typical response might be encouragement or advice. But a Socratic question would ask, "What does success look like to you?" And when they answer, "Making a lot of money," the next question arrives, "Why is money important to you?" Each question peels back a layer, leading them closer to their core motivations, and perhaps their hidden fears. This isn't manipulation, it's a service. Socratic questioning isn't about controlling the conversation, it's about liberating deeper thought. A truly good question respects the other person's agency. It doesn't impose truth, it invites discovery. To master this kind of questioning, we must develop restraint, resist the urge to fix. Resist the temptation to impress, ask, and then ask again. If the first answer feels rehearsed, keep going. Truth often hides beneath familiarity. Sometimes the third or fourth question is the one that causes someone to pause, not because they're stumped, but because they've never been asked it before. And when you ask a powerful question, don't be surprised if the conversation shifts. The person sits back, their eyes narrow. They say, "That's a good question." In that moment, they're not answering you, they're meeting themselves. Some questions are answered and forgotten, but others linger. They resurface days later, at night, in the quiet. These are questions that echo, not because they're loud, but because they're deep. Ask those. Surface-level questions yield surface-level answers. Powerful questions are open, layered, and non-judgmental. The best questions invite others to meet themselves more honestly. When was the last time someone's question stayed with you? In your next conversation, ask a second follow-up question, and listen not just for the answer, but for what it reveals underneath. Chapter 3. The map is not the territory. In the 16th century, explorers carried hand-drawn maps across oceans, filled with imagined coastlines and ominous phrases like "Here be dragons." These maps were more hopeful than accurate, sketches of what might exist beyond the known. Sailors trusted them, sometimes fatally, because when the map does not match the terrain, confidence becomes danger. Our beliefs work the same way. Each of us carries mental maps, assumptions, expectations, inherited truths. They help us navigate life. But often we forget they're just maps, not the territory itself. Socrates understood this better than anyone. He devoted his life to helping people see the difference between what they assumed and what was actually so. His method? Asking questions that forced them to compare their inner maps with reality. A statesman might declare, "Justice is giving each man what he deserves." Socrates would nod, then ask, "What if a friend asks you for a weapon in a moment of rage? Would justice mean giving it to him?" That one question reveals the crack in the map. Suddenly, what felt solid becomes uncertain. The conversation moves from the comfort of claims to the complexity of thought. We live in a world brimming with unchallenged assumptions. We assume success means money, that confidence means truth, and that disagreement means disrespect. We treat opinions like facts and preferences like universal law. But what if some of our most cherished beliefs are little more than inherited cartography, passed down, unexamined? Socratic questioning challenges these maps, not to destroy them, but to make them more accurate. It begins with the premise that every belief rests on something deeper. When someone says people can't change, the Socratic move isn't to argue, but to ask, what led you to believe that? Or have you seen examples where that wasn't true? These questions are gentle probes, designed not to force a shift, but to invite one. The power lies in what happens next. Most people don't examine the roots of their opinions. They've never been asked to. When you inquire kindly, they're often surprised at what surfaces. They might realize their belief came from one experience, one heartbreak, one piece of advice from someone they never thought to question. Suddenly, the ground beneath the belief begins to shift. This is where transformation happens, not through confrontation, but through realization. Socrates never told people what to believe. He simply held up a mirror and let them wrestle with their own reflections. That kind of questioning requires patience. You don't blast through someone's worldview. You chip away, gently, persistently, respectfully. The goal isn't to win an argument. It's to refine the map, to ask, is that belief helping you see the world more clearly, or is it leading you into blind spots? When done well, this kind of questioning doesn't feel like interrogation. It feels like curiosity wrapped in care. And we must apply it inward, too. What maps are we carrying that no longer serve us? What dragons have we drawn in places we've never actually explored? Thinking like Socrates means being willing to doubt not only others' assumptions, but our own, especially our own. Truth isn't afraid of questions. Illusions are. Every time we challenge an assumption, kindly, wisely, persistently, we make room for clearer vision. We stop navigating by rumor and start navigating by reality. Because in the end, it's not the map that gets us where we're going. It's the courage to ask whether it still fits the terrain. Assumptions are mental maps, often flawed or outdated. Socratic questions reveal the beliefs underneath our statements. True understanding begins when we examine, not defend, what we think we know. What long-held belief have you never truly questioned? Today, ask someone, what led you to that belief? Then listen, not to reply, but to understand what shaped their map. Chapter 4. Listen like a mirror. In a quiet room, a therapist leaned forward as her client unraveled years of pain. She said almost nothing. No advice, no solutions, just a steady, attentive presence. At the end of the session, the client exhaled, eyes wet, and whispered, "I've never felt so heard." What changed the room wasn't clever interpretation, it was the kind of listening that reflects rather than reacts. Socrates rarely spoke more than necessary. He would ask a question, then go quiet. When his conversation partners responded, he didn't interrupt. He listened, not as a tactic, but as a philosophy. For Socrates, listening was inseparable from inquiry. A question without deep listening is just noise. It may seem like engagement, but it's still self-centered if we're merely waiting for our turn to speak. Most people think of questioning as an active process, something you do to others. But the real power of Socratic inquiry lies in the space between questions. Listening becomes the container that gives a question weight. Without it, even the most insightful prompts fall flat. We must learn to listen like a mirror, clear, still, and undistorted. In our fast-paced culture, real listening is rare. We listen for keywords. We anticipate arguments. We finish others' sentences. We're conditioned to consume information, not to absorb presence. But Socratic listening is different. It doesn't aim to evaluate or advise. It listens to understand how someone is thinking, not just what they're saying. That shift changes everything. When someone says, "I'm just overwhelmed," we might be tempted to respond with suggestions, time management tips, encouraging cliches. But a Socratic listener leans in and asks, "What feels most overwhelming?" Then listens, not just for the words, but for the emotions behind them. Maybe their voice tightens when they mention work. Maybe they pause when discussing family. These clues are breadcrumbs, leading to something deeper. Now, to listen like Socrates is to attend not only to content but to context. Notice tone, energy, timing. Notice what's said and what's not. Sometimes the greatest insight comes from what a person avoids. Silence, hesitation, repetition, these are all part of the language behind the language. Socrates didn't just hear answers, he heard the soul behind them. This kind of listening is uncomfortable. It requires surrendering the need to control the conversation. You're not steering, you're witnessing. And yet, it's this very detachment that creates connection. People begin to feel seen. Not judged, not fixed, just seen. And that experience, for many, is profoundly healing. Listening like a mirror also means reflecting without distortion. You paraphrase without twisting. You affirm without inflating. You offer back what you've heard with simplicity and sincerity. So what I hear is that you feel stuck, not because you're lazy, but because you're afraid of disappointing someone. In that moment, a person often hears their truth more clearly than when they said it. Socrates practiced this in every exchange. His restraint was radical. While others rushed to dominate with words, he opened space with silence. His questions were invitations, and his listening was hospitality. He created a room in which others could hear themselves think. When you listen like this, questions begin to shape themselves. You don't plan them in advance. They emerge organically, born from presence. And because they are attuned to the speaker's world, they land with resonance. In a culture addicted to noise, Socratic listening is rebellion. It says, "I value your mind enough to make space for it." That, in itself, is a question. A question that doesn't need words to ask, and often, it's the most powerful question of all. Listening is the silent partner of great questioning. Reflective listening helps others feel seen and think more clearly. Presence shapes the quality and depth of the next question you ask. When was the last time you truly listened without preparing your reply? Today, in one conversation, mirror back what someone says, without adding your opinion. Let them hear their own thoughts reflected. Chapter 5. The Wisdom in the Pause. Just before a rocket launches, there is a moment of silence. The engines are primed, the countdown has reached 0, but there's a breath, a stillness, before ignition. That pause, brief as it is, contains everything: anticipation, tension, possibility. In conversation, silence holds similar power. It is not an absence but a presence, a signal that something important is about to unfold. Socrates understood the language of silence. After asking a question, he didn't fill the space with reassurance or repetition. He waited. Sometimes his companions fumbled or grew uncomfortable, but he let the pause linger, trusting that thought needs room to breathe. The moments after a question are sacred. Rushing them is like planting a seed and then digging it up before it takes root. In our culture, silence is often mistaken for failure. We equate it with awkwardness, boredom, or disapproval. In meetings, a few seconds of quiet feels unbearable. On dates, we scramble to keep the conversation flowing. Even in personal reflection, many flee the stillness by checking their phones or reaching for noise. But the Socratic method teaches us that silence is not the enemy of dialogue, it is its companion. Powerful questions demand space. Not every answer comes quickly. Sometimes a person has to feel their way toward the truth. If we interrupt that process with commentary, even well-meaning, we rob them of discovery. The pause allows discomfort to rise, and in that discomfort, clarity can emerge. Silence says, "You don't need to rush, take your time. I'm listening." When we resist silence, we often do so out of anxiety. We fear we'll lose control of the conversation, appear uninformed, or make others uncomfortable. But Socratic questioning is not about control, it is about holding space. And holding space sometimes means saying nothing at all. A manager once asked her employee, "What do you think is causing the tension on your team?" The employee looked down, then up, then down again. The manager waited. 10 seconds passed. Then the employee said, "Honestly, I think I'm part of the problem." That confession would never have surfaced if the manager had jumped in with suggestions or sympathy. The silence was uncomfortable, but necessary. To pause well, we must first trust it. We must believe that silence can carry the weight of a question forward. Socrates trusted his listeners. He didn't need to dominate the exchange. He wasn't afraid of uncertainty. That's why his conversations often felt less like debates and more like slow unravelings. There's another kind of silence, too, the one we hold before responding. When someone speaks, our minds leap ahead. We prepare our replies before they've even finished. But thinking like Socrates means letting their words land. Letting them echo. Only then do we respond, not from reflex, but from reflection. In this way, silence becomes part of the question itself. It adds dimension, depth, and gravity. It invites the speaker to not only answer but to explore. It slows down time, just enough for insight to catch up. This discipline of pausing applies inwardly as well. When we feel defensive, offended, or anxious, the impulse is to react, but a Socratic pause allows a breath. It creates space for a better question to arise. Why did that upset me? What am I assuming? What else might be true? In the space between question and answer, something invisible shifts. The pause becomes a pivot. A small stillness where truth waits, quietly to be heard. Don't rush it. Silence is not empty, it's the space where thought takes form. Pausing after a question allows for deeper, more honest answers. The ability to hold silence reflects confidence, care, and wisdom. Where in your conversations do you fill the silence too quickly? In your next interaction, ask one thoughtful question, then wait. Count to 10 before saying anything else. Let the pause do its work. Chapter 6. Not a debate, but a dance. In ballroom dancing, one partner leads while the other follows, yet both remain in sync, listening through motion. A misstep isn't corrected with commands, but with subtle shifts, pressure, eye contact, and breath. The point is not to control, but to move together. Socratic questioning shares this rhythm. It's not about pinning someone into a corner with logic, it's about inviting them into a shared inquiry. Modern discourse often resembles sparring more than dancing. Arguments are won or lost, points are scored, and certainty becomes the prize. But Socrates wasn't interested in winning. He didn't ask questions to trap or humiliate. He asked to understand. When he challenged someone, it was never to embarrass, it was to help them uncover contradictions they hadn't seen. And when they resisted, he stayed in the conversation, gracefully, patiently, like a partner in a difficult but vital dance. This approach requires a different mindset. Most people enter dialogue with an agenda to persuade, defend, convert, or impress. But the Socratic mindset is one of co-exploration. It says, let's walk around this idea together. Let's see where it holds and where it wobbles. There's humility in that posture, but also strength. It's the strength to let go of winning and to aim instead for clarity. A student once asked his professor how to argue better. The professor replied, "Don't argue, guide." That's what Socratic questioning does. It guides. It doesn't shove or shame. It doesn't dazzle with intellect or corner with cleverness. It gently redirects, invites deeper thought, and makes room for reconsideration. The conversation becomes dynamic, less like a courtroom, more like choreography. To do this well, tone matters. A question asked with suspicion feels like an attack. The same question, asked with curiosity, feels like care. What makes you say that? Can come across as confrontational or compassionate depending on how it's delivered. Socratic questioning depends not only on the content of the question, but on the spirit in which it's asked. People don't resist questions because they're afraid of the truth. They resist because they feel judged. But when you ask with genuine interest, defenses lower. The mind opens. Even in disagreement, there's respect. That's what made Socrates so effective, not just the questions he asked, but how he asked them. He didn't rush. He didn't provoke. He invited. This is especially important in tense conversations. When someone feels attacked, their brain moves into survival mode. Logic shuts down. But a skillful questioner creates safety. They allow the other person to think out loud, change their mind, or even contradict themselves without fear. That freedom is crucial. It means the conversation can evolve, not just escalate. Socratic questioning also recognizes when to let the question stand. Some truths don't need a rebuttal. They just need a moment of silence and a well-placed, gentle inquiry. Is that always true? Have you ever seen a time when it wasn't? These are not traps, they are invitations to reconsider. And when offered with grace, they open minds far more than arguments ever will. To think like Socrates is to abandon the need to be right. It's to replace confrontation with conversation, and certainty with curiosity. That doesn't mean passivity, it means precision. It means choosing your questions like a dancer chooses each step, aware of the rhythm, attentive to your partner, and committed to the beauty of movement, not the thrill of domination. Because in the end, the most transformative dialogues aren't battles, they're dances. Socratic questioning guides rather than confronts. Tone and intention shape how a question is received. Conversations thrive when both people feel safe to think aloud. Where are you approaching dialogue as a debate rather than a shared exploration? In your next disagreement, ask one curious question instead of making a counterpoint, then pause and let the dance unfold. Chapter 7. The question behind the question. In a shop window in St. Petersburg sits a row of matryoshka dolls, each wooden figure opening to reveal a smaller one inside, layer after layer, until only a sliver of wood remains. What seems like one object is actually many, hidden within each other. Socratic questioning follows this same pattern. The first response is never the last. Every answer contains another question waiting to be uncovered. People often speak in summaries. They say, "I want to be more confident," or "I just need clarity." These statements feel complete. But they're just headlines. Socrates didn't accept headlines. He read between the lines. If someone said, "I want to be successful," he might ask, "What does success mean to you?" Then, when they replied, "Making a difference," he pressed further, "Why is that important to you?" And then, "Who taught you that?" One question births another, and with each the illusion of simplicity gives way to real insight. We're not trained to ask this way. Most conversations skim the surface. We treat people's first answers as final truths, unaware that many haven't even questioned their own responses. They're repeating inherited ideas or socially acceptable replies. But when you keep asking, respectfully and persistently, something begins to shift. People pause. They reflect. They begin to hear themselves more deeply. This isn't about interrogation, it's about excavation. Like an archaeologist with a brush, you gently sweep away the dust, revealing what lies beneath. Sometimes that's fear. Sometimes it's longing. Sometimes it's a contradiction someone has carried for years without realizing it. Layered questioning doesn't push, it reveals. A teacher once asked a student, "Why didn't you turn in your essay?" The student shrugged, "I didn't have time." The teacher might have stopped there. But instead, she asked, "What took your time?" The student hesitated, then admitted, "I was helping my mom with her night shifts." One more question. "How long have you been doing that?" And out came a story of sacrifice, exhaustion, and maturity beyond his years. The issue wasn't laziness, it was loyalty. But that truth only emerged because someone kept asking. Layered questions require patience. You can't rush them. The space between them is just as important as the questions themselves. Each one must be asked not as a demand, but as a gift, an opening. And while it's tempting to jump to interpretation, the true power comes from letting the other person discover the answer themselves. That's what Socrates understood. He didn't offer conclusions. He walked others to the edge of their own insight and let them look down. This kind of questioning also applies inward. When we feel anxious, we might ask, "Why am I nervous?" The first answer might be, "Because I'm not prepared." But beneath that could be, "Because I'm afraid of failing," and under that, "Because I tie my worth to performance." If we stop at the surface, we never get to the root. But when we keep digging, we arrive at truths that can finally be addressed. Socratic questioning doesn't seek immediate resolution. It seeks honest complexity. It knows that real transformation doesn't come from quick fixes, but from deeper clarity. And clarity often comes disguised as discomfort. It takes courage to keep asking. But those who do are often rewarded not just with better answers, but with better understanding of themselves and others. So don't stop at the first stall. Keep opening, keep peeling. Keep asking. That's where the truth begins to speak. Most answers are just summaries, true insight lives underneath. Layered questioning gently reveals the belief behind the belief. Persistence in questioning fosters self-discovery and deeper clarity. What important question in your life deserves a second or third layer? In your next conversation, go one layer deeper. Ask, "Why does that matter to you?" And let the answer unfold. Chapter 8. Ask with your heart. A prison counselor once sat across from a hardened inmate known for silence. Others had tried to reach him with rules, programs, even sermons. Nothing worked. But one day the counselor simply asked, "Who believed in you before you ended up here?" The man looked stunned, then whispered, "My grandmother." He spoke her name like a prayer. Something cracked open. Not because the question was brilliant, but because it was tender, human, and real. Socrates didn't ask from the safety of detachment. His questions weren't cold instruments of logic. They came from a place of deep engagement. He saw questioning not just as an intellectual exercise, but as a form of care. His inquiries weren't just about ideas, they were about people. He challenged, yes, but always with the aim of helping others live examined, awakened lives. We often think of inquiry as clinical, objective, emotionless, surgical. But the best questions come not just from the mind, but from the heart. When we ask with empathy, something shifts, the listener feels it. A wall comes down. Socratic questioning becomes less about cleverness and more about connection. Consider the difference between what's wrong with you and what happened to you. The first isolates, the second invites. One assumes blame, the other honors pain. A question that acknowledges someone's humanity has the power to move them toward healing. It may be the first time someone feels truly seen. To ask this way, we must slow down. We must be willing to feel what the other person might be feeling. Empathy in inquiry means entering their world, not dragging them into ours. It means asking not only what they believe, but how they got there, and what it cost them. What's at stake for you in this belief? Where did that story begin? What do you wish people understood about this? These are not soft questions, they are sacred ones. Empathetic questioning doesn't mean we avoid challenge. It means we challenge with care. Socrates could be fierce, but he wasn't cruel. He didn't use questions as weapons. He used them as mirrors. When someone made a claim, he questioned it to help them see where it might not hold, but he did so in a way that honored their capacity to grow. He believed people could handle hard truths, especially when delivered with respect. This is especially important in fragile conversations. When people speak from places of pain, trauma, loss, regret, they're not just offering thoughts. They're offering parts of themselves. A careless question can close the door. A compassionate one can open it wider. Timing, tone, and trust become as important as the question itself. Asking with your heart also means holding space for silence, emotion, and even tears. You don't rush to fix. You don't pivot away. You stay. You witness. Sometimes the most powerful question is the one you let hang in the air, knowing that it might take time to answer, not minutes, but days. That's okay. Socratic questioning isn't a transaction. It's a process. Empathy also turns inward. When we question ourselves, we must resist the urge to berate. Instead of asking, "Why do I always mess this up?" ask, "What pain am I trying to protect myself from?" instead of, "What's wrong with me?" Try, "What do I need right now?" When we offer ourselves compassion through inquiry, we access honesty without shame. Socrates showed us that the soul responds best not to judgment, but to wonder. When we ask with heart, we don't just help others think more deeply, we help them feel safe enough to be real. And in that space, something sacred happens. Insight is born, not through force, but through presence. Ask wisely. But above all, ask kindly. Empathy deepens the impact of any question. Socratic questioning honors the humanity behind the belief. Compassionate inquiry invites honesty without shame. When was the last time a question made you feel truly seen? In your next conversation, ask a question that reflects care, not curiosity alone. Then pause and let the heart respond. Chapter 9. Inner Dialogue. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher, began each day with a journal. He didn't write for others. He wasn't performing. He asked himself questions. What is within my control? What am I afraid of today? Where am I letting ego lead me? These weren't diary entries, they were exercises in examination. Like Socrates, he knew that the quality of his thinking depended on the quality of his inner dialogue. Most of us are in constant conversation with ourselves. We narrate, judge, doubt, defend, and plan. But that voice is rarely questioned, it becomes the background noise we mistake for truth. Socratic inquiry invites us to turn our questions inward, not with self-criticism, but with self-clarity. If it's powerful to ask others what they believe and why, it's even more powerful to ask ourselves. The first step is noticing the scripts we run. I always mess things up. No one respects me. I'm just not good at relationships. These lines often go unchallenged. They feel like observations, but they're actually beliefs formed by experience, fear, and repetition. Left unchecked, they shape how we act, what we expect, and how we interpret others. Socratic questioning teaches us to press pause and ask, is that true? And if so, what's the evidence? If not, why do I keep saying it? The goal isn't to eliminate negative thoughts, it's to examine them. To look beneath the surface and ask where they come from, what they're protecting, and whether they still serve us. A question like, what am I afraid will happen if I try and fail? Can open a door. Suddenly the issue isn't failure, it's shame, or disappointment, or loss of identity. And once that's named, it can be addressed. This process isn't easy. Turning Socratic questioning inward requires courage. It's easier to analyze others, but the real transformation begins when we interrogate our own assumptions, our own contradictions, our own unexamined truths. It's the intellectual version of looking in a mirror, and staying there long enough to see what's really reflected. A young entrepreneur once said, "I can't lead a team. I'm not cut out for it." When asked why, she said, "Because I don't have a dominant personality." But when pressed further, what does leadership really require? What stories are you telling yourself about dominance and value? She realized her idea of leadership was shaped by a single past boss who used intimidation as a tactic. That one experience had become her inner map. Socratic inquiry helped her redraw it. Journaling is one way to practice this. Not as a record of events, but as a tool of thought. Ask yourself questions on paper. What am I avoiding? Where did I get that belief? What would change if I thought differently? Let the page be your mirror. Socrates didn't write books, but if he had, his journal would have been filled with questions, not answers. That's the spirit to bring into your own reflections. This inner dialogue becomes a quiet teacher. Over time, it shapes your outer voice. You begin asking others the kinds of questions you've learned to ask yourself. You become more patient, more present, more perceptive. Because you've already done the work of inquiry within, you can now extend it outward with humility and grace. The examined life, Socrates said, is the only life worth living. That examination begins not in public debate or philosophical discourse, but in the solitude of one's own mind. The Socratic method is not just a tool for conversation, it's a path to inner freedom. Ask within. You may be surprised by what answers arise. Inner dialogue shapes how we see ourselves in the world. Socratic self-questioning uncovers the roots of limiting beliefs. Journaling can become a practice of personal transformation. What recurring belief about yourself have you never paused to question? Write down one self-critical thought you often have. Then ask, is this true? What belief is beneath it? Let the answer guide your next step. Chapter 10. Conversations that Disarm. Two neighbors stood on opposite sides of a property dispute. Years of tension had hardened into silence. Lawyers were involved. Each blamed the other. Then, during a last attempt at mediation, one of them was asked a single question: what would resolution look like for you, if this wasn't about being right? The man leaned back. His face softened. He looked at his neighbor and said, I just want to feel respected. The other nodded. That moment ended the feud, not with a compromise, but with understanding. Socratic questioning does something extraordinary in conflict. It diffuses without dismissing. Instead of escalating tension, it explores it. Rather than arguing, it uncovers. When used wisely, questions become keys that unlock defensiveness, soften postures, and guide people to their deeper needs. They don't avoid hard truths, they make room for them to emerge safely. Most arguments aren't about facts, they're about identity, fear, hurt, and pride. When people argue about politics, it's often about belonging. When couples argue about dishes, it's rarely about the dishes. But if you respond with counter-arguments, the other person digs in. Their brain interprets it as an attack. Defensiveness rises. Logic shuts down. That's where most conversations get stuck. Two people talking, neither being heard. Socrates never used questions to trap. He used them to liberate. When someone made a bold claim, he didn't refute them. He asked, what do you mean by that? Or is there ever a time when that's not true? These questions don't accuse, they reveal. They invite the speaker to examine their own thoughts without shame. And because they're not confrontational, they lower the emotional temperature of the exchange. This is especially powerful in personal relationships. When someone lashes out, instead of reacting, a Socratic approach might ask, what are you hoping I'll understand right now? That question shifts the frame. It acknowledges the emotion without fueling the fire. Or when a friend makes a harsh judgment, you might ask, what's beneath that reaction for you? These questions don't surrender truth, they search for it together. Tone matters. The same question can build trust or destroy it, depending on how it's asked. Socratic questions are most effective when they carry the weight of respect. When asked with genuine curiosity, they disarm not just the other person, but the tension itself. The space between question and response becomes a moment of possibility. In workplace conflict, Socratic questioning can be transformative. Instead of saying you're wrong, a manager might ask, what outcome are you most hoping for in this situation? Or what part of this feels unfair to you? These questions don't concede authority, but they do model humility. They say, I care more about understanding than dominating. And when people feel heard, they soften, they listen back. Conflict isn't the problem. Unexamined conflict is. Socratic dialogue makes space for disagreement without destruction. It turns impasse into inquiry. It changes the question from who's right to what's true. And that shift, subtle as it may seem, often changes everything. There's no guarantee a question will resolve a conflict, but it can change the nature of it. It can reveal shared values, mutual fears, and common ground. And from that ground, something new can be built, not a truce of silence, but a bridge of understanding. Socrates didn't just want people to think more clearly. He wanted them to live more wisely. And wisdom, especially in conflict, often begins not with answers, but with the right question, asked at the right moment, with the right heart. Ask to uncover, not to win. Conflict is often fueled by unexamined emotion, not logic. Socratic questions gently surface deeper needs and assumptions. Dialogue grounded in curiosity creates space for real resolution. When have you used answers to defend when a question might have disarmed you? In your next difficult conversation, ask, "What do you most want me to understand?" and then truly listen to the answer. Chapter 11: The Leader Who Asks. A CEO once walked into a leadership meeting with no agenda. Instead of giving directives, he asked a simple question: "What's getting in the way of your best work?" At first, his team hesitated. They were used to being told, not invited. But slowly, voices emerged. One spoke about inefficient processes. Another mentioned unspoken tension between departments. The CEO nodded, listened, and asked, "What would it look like to solve that together?" That meeting changed everything, not because he provided answers, but because he created the conditions for truth to surface. Socrates never held a title or office, but he led minds. His leadership came not from authority, but from inquiry. He didn't impose vision, he revealed blind spots. His questions moved people, not by force, but by insight. In that sense, Socratic questioning is one of the most underused tools of leadership. It shifts the focus from telling people what to think to helping them think more deeply. Most leaders feel pressure to have the answers. It's seen as a strength. But the truth is, a leader who always answers leaves no room for growth. Socratic leadership starts with a different assumption, that those closest to the work often carry the solutions, they just need the right questions to unlock them. What do you see that I don't? What are we assuming here? If we weren't afraid of failing, what might we try? These are not just conversation starters, they're catalysts for change. Asking questions, as a leader, signals trust. It tells your team, your voice matters, your insight is valuable. That alone can elevate morale, but more importantly, it fosters ownership. When people participate in the formation of solutions, they're more invested in the outcome. Socratic questioning, then, becomes not just a leadership technique, it becomes a culture. It also has the power to surface hidden tensions. Teams often carry silent frustrations, issues no one names, problems everyone tiptoes around. Directives won't fix what people won't say, but a well-placed question can lower defenses. What are we pretending not to see? What's one thing we're avoiding that needs our attention? These aren't accusations. They're openings. They create room for honesty, which is the bedrock of effective leadership. Even in moments of conflict or underperformance, Socratic leaders resist the impulse to lecture. Instead, they ask, what got in the way, or what support would have made a difference? This doesn't absolve accountability, it deepens it. It invites reflection, not just compliance, and it helps people grow from mistakes rather than hide from them. Leading this way requires courage. It's easier to control than to question. It's safer to dictate than to dialogue, but control breeds dependency. Dialogue fosters autonomy. Socratic leadership is less about being in charge, and more about bringing clarity to chaos. It's the quiet confidence to trust that a well-asked question can do more than a dozen commands. It also transforms the leader. By asking rather than telling, leaders become learners. They hear perspectives they would have missed. They challenge their own assumptions. They stay humble, adaptive, and awake. Socrates led by example, not because he knew everything, but because he knew how to keep searching. The leader who asks doesn't abdicate responsibility. They elevate everyone else's. They recognize that the best ideas are rarely the loudest and that people long to be invited into meaning, not managed into obedience. This kind of leadership is rare. But when it's practiced, it changes not just the organization, but the people within it. Ask to lead. Then listen as others rise. Great leaders ask questions that surface insight, not just information. Socratic inquiry in leadership fosters trust, ownership, and clarity. Questioning cultivates a culture of growth rather than control. Where are you leading with answers when a question might unlock more? In your next leadership moment, ask, what do you need most from me right now? And let the answer guide your next move. Take care and be well.